Hey Jags, in preparation for nationals, I am finishing up a couple of videos here for you in preparation for public forum. You've already seen the video, hopefully, that I did on Lincoln Douglas as well. If you need that information, that's also been posted to Debate Acidia. But this one's just about the public forum topic coming up in just a little under a month at nationals. So this video is going to basically run through the big terms that you need to know in the topic, what it means, and then also we'll look at both the pro and the con cases that I've put up on the drive just so that you can be looking at them if you have any questions. All right. As with anything, if you have questions, feel free to drop me a message on Facebook or elsewhere, and I'll be happy to answer those as soon as possible. Like I said, feel free to use the cases, change them, do your own research on them, etc. I think it'll make it as good as humanly possible if you do those things. So with that said, let's try to figure out what it takes to bring home a trophy from nationals in public forum, and we'll go ahead and get started. If you haven't seen yet, the topic for public forum for this month is that on balance, the benefits of United States participation in the North American Free Trade Agreement outweigh the consequences. And so if you haven't yet read anything about that, then there's a couple of big terms here that you probably need to be aware of. Let me kind of run through what those are. The first set of terms is the term United States participation. And the reason I think that is so important is because there's a lot of the discussion about NAFTA, which is short for the North America Free Trade Agreement, is about whether or not NAFTA in general is good or bad. And I think while that's an important question, really the heart of this question is whether or not the United States should be involved. We will actually be making an argument, I think, in one of the cases about why U.S. involvement is particularly important for this conversation. But I think that in general, you need to understand that the topic is not just, is NAFTA good or bad? The topic is the U.S. participation in NAFTA good or bad? The second part of the topic is the North American Free Trade Agreement. And we'll talk here in just a minute about what that means and what that looks like, how long that's been in existence, and what it exactly engages in. And then finally, the end of the topic, which talks about if the benefits outweigh the consequences. And I think that when it comes to doing this, that's a really important phrase for you to think about, especially in the last speeches, because both the final pro and the final con speech are going to need to be talking about why they outweigh each other, not just why one is different than the other. Okay? So with that said, let's go ahead and take a few minutes and just talk about what NAFTA is. So NAFTA, or the North American Free Trade Agreement, if I were flowing this, I'm just going to write NAFTA. That's a term that most of your judges should be familiar with. It's especially in the United States, anyone who is pretty much older than maybe 30 is going to be very familiar with NAFTA. They're going to have heard about NAFTA. In fact, if you look back in history, there was a big discussion about NAFTA in the presidential elections in 92 and in 96. And so people who were coming of age around that time would have been very familiar with what it meant. There was, in fact, an independent candidate who ran in one of the elections named Ross Perot, who NAFTA was one of his big campaign issues. If you were to trace that back a little bit further, all the way back to 1979, Ronald Reagan, who many people say is like the quintessential Republican president, the one that almost all Republicans look back on and say, he was awesome, he was our hero. Ronald Reagan campaigned in 1979 before he was elected in 1980 on a promise to create better trade between the three countries in North America, between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. And so he was trying to figure that out all the way back then. As things have kind of transitioned, it really has become much more where Donald Trump hates NAFTA and campaigned against NAFTA, and that there's a lot of discussion about whether or not it was actually a Republican idea or a Democrat idea. But the truth is that it was initially proposed, that kind of a concept was initially proposed in 1979 by Ronald Reagan, and it ultimately came into fruition or became a law on January 1st of 1994, which was under Bill Clinton's presidency, and so who was a Democrat. So we see kind of this place where there's this law that's been in existence for almost 25 years now that asks the question of whether or not it's good or bad for the United States to be involved in it. Now, when we think about what the North American Free Trade Agreement is, it has several different components. So in some ways, it's a lot like the European Union, where in the European Union, people can travel around, they can sell within other countries in the European Union, they use the same currency, and it really prevents there being like one country that takes a lot of advantage of the others. In the United States, NAFTA didn't really work exactly this way, although it tried to. So NAFTA would say that it was problematic for countries to put tariffs or taxes on goods and services that were being produced in the other countries. So, for example, if a drug was being produced, for example, to help fix cancer, was being produced in Canada, then it would be illegal for the United States to put a tax on that from Canada. Now, you might ask yourself, why would any country ever put a tax on something like that? The basic reason is this, is that the reason you would put a tax there is to help protect the businesses inside the country that are trying to do the same thing. So, for example, in the United States, it costs a lot more for labor. So when someone goes and does something like builds a car, you have to pay them more money than if the exact same job was being done by someone in Mexico. There's a variety of reasons for this, but ultimately, one of the realities there is that it means that for a car to be made in the United States, it costs the car company a lot more money than if the exact same car was made in Mexico and then shipped north. The problem with that is that if there are no taxes, then the United States feels like they can't compete. They don't have the same ability. So if a customer goes into a place to buy a car and they see the exact same car, one's produced in Mexico, one's produced in the United States, and the difference is, say, several thousand US dollars or several tens of thousand dirham, the customer is probably going to buy the less expensive one, which means that the companies in the United States can't keep their workers employed, and it causes other problems. So when the law was passed, it initially said that it was illegal for countries to put taxes, or tariffs is what they're called, on goods and services that are shipped from one country inside North America to another country inside North America. This has ultimately helped a lot of things and hurt some other things. Realistically, the United States, two of the biggest trading partners with the United States are Canada and Mexico. The biggest trade partner for Mexico is the United States. The biggest trade partner for Canada is the United States. And so there's a lot of benefit for both Canada and Mexico to continue trading as much as humanly possible with the US. But there have also been some negative things as well. So here in just a second, now that we've kind of got a basic understanding of what NAFTA is, how it came into fruition, we'll spend a little bit of time talking about the pro case and a little bit of time talking about the con case. So I'm going to stop for just about 10 seconds, and if you have questions, this would be a perfect time to hit pause on the video, talk about it amongst yourselves, and then we'll jump right into the pro case. Excellent. So on this topic, I think that the main thing that the pro has to be thinking about is whether or not it's good for the US to be involved in NAFTA. Whether or not it is helpful for the US, whether or not it would be harmful for anything, and trying to think through the arguments that other people are going to argue. Now, I'll tell you honestly, I think that the main arguments on both the pro and the con on this topic are going to revolve around, number one, the economy, and number two is the environment. And so I think on both of those topics, there's a lot of literature out there about it. There are other things that people may talk about, such as workers' rights and such as some of the other dynamics that just are at play between them. But I think that for the most part, the questions are going to revolve around economics and the environment. And so the cases have been built around those two questions because I think that's where the majority of people are going to be talking, and I want your cases to be structured to answer those main arguments. Now, on the pro case, there are just three contentions, and the first contention is just about framing, okay? And so I think this argument's pretty important. I think that if you are pro first, especially, you want to have this in there. If you're pro second, you might want to make the decision not to read this contention, depending on how the con case is structured. So contention one is talking about framing, and basically the argument is that the questions about how it affects Canada and Mexico should fundamentally be ignored because the topic only talks about the U.S. involvement. There's a piece of evidence here that is from just a couple of days ago that talks about how Mexico and Canada have actually set up lots of other free trade agreements with Europe and with Asia. And the reason that that evidence is really important is because it sets up this notion for the judge that whether you vote pro or con, it actually doesn't change anything for Canada or Mexico, because those two countries will continue to have all of the good and all of the bad things when it comes to free trade. So, for example, if the con team argues that free trade agreements cause workers' rights violations, you're able to use this argument to say that may be true, but free trade agreements are going to be inevitable in the current system, meaning that whether you vote pro or con, Canada and Mexico will continue to trade with Europe and with Asia through these things. So if you're right that free trade agreements are bad, those harms are still going to be there regardless of how you vote. The only thing that the topic really asks is that you think about how it works in the context of U.S. involvement in NAFTA. And so it's only questions about how NAFTA affects the U.S. and consequentially then affects the rest of the world. So I think that piece of evidence is pretty good. I think that you can make some good arguments and use that to help frame the debate. And so by arguing that, you can then look at a couple of reasons why U.S. involvement in NAFTA is positive and be able to kind of argue back against some of the main things the con will argue. Contention 2 talks about the economy. And first of all, it gives two specific reasons why NAFTA is good for the economy. The first reason is that it creates a specific type of visas. Now, we all know a lot about visas right now as we're getting ready to go over to the United States for nationals, but NAFTA specifically creates two types of visas for people coming into the United States from Mexico and from Canada. One is called the TN visa, and one is called the E visa. Now, these are really important because they allow people to move between Canada, the United States, and Mexico for work without having to go through a lot of the processes that we would have to go through to go to nationals. And I think that you can kind of spin this really well from your perspective. If you think about it, that like if it wasn't for these, every time that someone from Mexico wanted to come up to the United States to go to work, they'd have to fill out all the paperwork, they'd have to do all the other details. It would make it really complicated for them to get a job. And so what I think that you say is that if NAFTA were to go away, these visas also go away. And these visas are really important because this evidence that is in here describes how it actually helps contribute to about 14 million jobs. Now, realistically, does it directly contribute to 14 million jobs? No. But what it does that indirectly. So, for example, if someone comes to the United States on a TN visa, they probably have to have someplace to live. They buy a car, so they have to have someone to fill up their gas. They have to have somewhere to go to get groceries and things of that nature. And so the evidence is pretty conclusive and pretty well worded, saying that these types of visas contribute a lot of jobs to the economy. Now, that's a pretty good reason why NAFTA is good and why U.S. involvement in it is critical, because if the U.S. were to withdraw from NAFTA, or to say that NAFTA no longer exists, or to say that we have to have specific changes and those visas might go away, especially with the current president, there might be some issues around that where he might say things like, well, the United States should be allowed to go to the other countries, but the other countries can't come to the United States. And if he does those kinds of things, it would really reduce the quantity of jobs that were being achieved. The second thing specifically that this evidence, the second thing that the evidence indicates is there's a second argument that says that NAFTA creates manufacturing jobs. Now, there is pretty good evidence that the con will read that says a lot of jobs left the United States when NAFTA happened. Now, it will use a thought that says that when it stopped having taxes and tariffs, companies like Ford or Chevy or GM, these big car companies and other companies, took their plants where they were making cars and moved them down to Mexico, because in the US they have to pay their workers, say, $25 an hour, and in Mexico they can pay them $25 a day. And so they were able to get a lot more work for a lot less money, so they moved them down there. However, this evidence says, and it's actually pretty good. So Moore, who the author of this evidence, she is a senior director of economics. So she does a lot of research on the economy, and she's probably pretty qualified to talk about this. And what she says is that it would actually really hurt some specific industries. And one of the industries that she talks about is chemical manufacturing. And so what happens there is that the US and Canada specifically share a lot of information back and forth when it comes to developing drugs and different chemicals, both for medicines and also for things like cars and things of that nature. What she says is that it has actually created a way to stop duplication. And so, because, look, if there's no taxes on it, then the US doesn't feel like it has to do the same thing. It can just say, okay, Canada, if you develop this, we'll take it without a tax and we'll use it here, and vice versa. If we develop it in the United States, Canada can use it or Mexico can use it without that. And so what it says is that abandoning NAFTA would raise prices, destroy demand for U.S. exports, and cause job losses. Specifically, the tariffs would increase production costs and disrupt regional integration, causing U.S. goods and exports to become more expensive and U.S. firms to lose their competitive advantage. And so what it talks about there is that these manufacturing jobs would go away because they would no longer be competitive with other countries. The subpoint B evidence here just talks about how the U.S. or how jobs are key to U.S. economic growth. So you can say, like, look, even if you're right that NAFTA has been bad for this reason, on comparison, the biggest, most important thing for the economy is jobs. And we give two specific ways that NAFTA creates jobs, which means if you're asking a question about the economy, the most important part of the economy is jobs. Two ways that NAFTA specifically creates jobs are through manufacturing jobs and also through the specific types of visas. Then you have contention 3, which is about the environment. There's a couple of specific things here that I think that one specific thing that I think you want to talk about here, which is that it would actually duplicate production if we didn't have NAFTA. It looks at a professor from AgroTrade, which is trade and agriculture business, who's really involved in the environment. And they talk about how if we all of a sudden stopped doing globalization, now this is a big term that you might want to be aware of. It talks about how globalization is basically free trade. So when the United States trades with another country, they have globalized trade. They're looking at it on a global perspective, not just on an individual perspective. What this evidence indicates is that when you go away from globalization to, say, for example, stopping NAFTA, that what it would do is that it would actually cause there to be less environmentally friendly situations. There would be situations where technology wouldn't be used as well, that it would hurt the environment, and that it would create problems. This argument is really, really defensive, though, for you, because one of, honestly, the main con arguments that you're going to hear in this debate is about how NAFTA actually hurts the environment because of CO2. But this at least gives you something to push back. If you need to cut something out of the constructive so that you have space to do it, cut this advantage out, this contention out, because you can always use it against the con when they say that it hurts the environment. The final argument that I think is actually pretty neat, and it's a unique trick, is contention 4, which is called due process. And let me just kind of walk through with you what this exactly looks like. So contention 4 talks about how that it's critical that the United States does NAFTA in order to create this space where laws, especially on an international level, are gone through in the correct way. Okay, so when the United States got involved in NAFTA when it started in 1994, it was an agreement between all three countries, between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. For the United States to just withdraw from it unilaterally or to say that we're not going to do that, it would actually send a really bad signal to the rest of the world that we really don't have to pay attention to the laws that are there. And I would argue that especially in light of new things that have happened over the last few days with Trump withdrawing from the Iran deal against everyone's suggestion, that it's actually really important that when the United States makes a promise that it follows the rules that happen when it comes to how those laws are engaged in. If the United States were to withdraw, what it would say is that we no longer follow through with the commitments that we made. We aren't going through the right process or the right steps in order to get NAFTA to get better. Now, this is pretty important because due process is really critical for justice. And so this argument, I think, is pretty neat in the sense that it's not something that the con is directly going to have an argument that counterbalances it. So if I were you, if I were putting this in the constructive, let's say, for example, that you are pro-second, I might just have two contentions, one about the economy, one about due process, and then I would maybe use the environment argument to answer their case. The reason for this is because I think that in the last speech, the final pro speech can say, look, at the end of the day, we're controlling the bigger parts of the economy. We are answering back the environment, and this due process argument isn't being answered at all. So on balance, while the economy probably flows to the pro, and while the environment is probably a wash, this due process thing means that on balance, it's actually more beneficial than the consequences of withdrawing. So I think that that's kind of why it's here, because I don't think that the con's going to have a lot of ways to answer it. Now, if you are con and someone does read something about due process, I think that you can make some logical arguments here to kind of counterbalance those. I think that if you were to talk about how the US just withdrew from Iran, it already means that a lot of the focus on the way the US engages in commitments is already shot. So whether the US withdraws from NAFTA or not, it doesn't really matter because those same problems are going to exist either way. So that's the pro case in a nutshell. If you have any questions, of course, feel free to Facebook me or send me a message in some other capacity. I'll be happy to answer through those. And we can definitely work on them when we all get down to Fort Lauderdale if you have any questions beyond that. Other than that, I'm going to go ahead and pause for about 10 seconds, and then we'll start talking about the con case. All right. On the con case, one of the things that I've done here is that I've actually steered away from kind of pushing into the economy stuff. There's lots of cards out there that say NAFTA hurts the economy, and honestly, you can find those cards pretty easily, which allows you to answer the pro case. What I've done instead is I've pushed it in another slightly different direction. We're going to focus a lot on the environment on the con case, and then also on diseases on the con case. I think both of these arguments show specific consequences that I don't think the pros are going to have really good answers to. So I think that'll kind of help you out here. So the first thing is that contention 1 talks about how NAFTA is bad for the environment. It gives two specific reasons why this is true. The first reason is that right now, and this is just a truth, that the way the laws are written, Canada can only do for climate change what the rest of the countries within NAFTA do. Canada is a very progressive country when it comes to environmental laws, but they actually have to match whatever the United States and whatever Mexico does with climate change because of the way NAFTA is written. The problem with that is that Canada would like to have things like no more carbon, or that there are some forms that punish companies for creating greenhouse gases, but they can't because of NAFTA. And so the first reason that this evidence isolates is that NAFTA actually creates a disincentive for companies that are within countries that are more progressive to take actions that would help the environment. That's the first major reason that it would create climate change. The second argument, which I think is a little bit more tricky, but I think is really true as well, is that right now, that as long as the United States is involved in NAFTA, that Trump gets to control the discussion about how it affects the environment. we know that Trump is not someone who thinks about the environment as a reality. In fact, he has done almost everything he can to dismantle the EPA, to help businesses at the expense of the environment, to reward polluters and those types of things. Realistically, some really, really bad stuff. But as long as the United States is involved in NAFTA, Trump will be the one who gets to dictate the terms of how the environment piece works. Because like I said earlier, where the United States has other major trading partners like China and like the EU, the main trading partners for Mexico and for Canada are the United States. In fact, the United States is the #1 trading partner for both of them. So both of them will listen to whatever the United States really wants when it comes to the questions of the environment. And since this is one of the big issues for Trump, realistically, they'll have to listen to his terrible ideas saying that climate change isn't real and saying that the environment is going to be just hunky-dory. Now, the argument here then says that there's two ways that NAFTA hurts the environment. The first is that it stops businesses from doing good things because of the way laws are written. And the second thing says that continued involvement means that Trump will be the one who controls the discussion, which means anything positive ever there would be rolled back. The Subpoint B evidence talks about how this is the biggest impact in the round. And the reason you want to argue this is because at the end of the day, you have to be able to say that the consequences outweigh the benefits. And so this evidence indicates that the biggest consequence to NAFTA is climate change, and that climate change is an extinction level argument. The reason that you want to be able to say this is that, look, like if climate change continues to rise and the sea levels rise and the Arctic caps melt and people start experiencing getting overheated and things of that nature, that it actually would cause extinction, not just of humans, but of all the plants and all the other animals. When it gets to that level, there's nothing that we can do to recover from it. So even if you're right, you might say as the con, even if the pro is right, that there are economic issues or that there are workers' rights issues, the economy doesn't matter and workers' rights don't really matter if we're all dead. And so you can kind of make that argument that the consequences of sticking with it are substantially worse than the benefits that you might get from being involved in it on a short term. Contention 2, I think, is actually kind of a unique argument that I don't think a lot of pro teams or con teams are going to have on this debate. It took me quite a while to find this argument, but I think it's pretty good. The argument is that NAFTA actually hinders development of drugs to help prevent diseases. And so this is a very, very capitalist argument that is very true. It's written from a capitalist perspective. The person who wrote this is the director of the Global Colon Cancer Association. But what they argue here is that the truth is that the US right now has to send its medicines to other countries without, and has to abide by those countries' laws, whatever they say about medicine. It's actually specifically problematic, this evidence says, because, for example, Canada says that a drug's price can never be higher than the average price of 7 other countries that have that same drug. And so, whereas in the United States right now, when a new drug gets developed, like for example, a new cancer drug gets developed, the law in the United States says that that drug gets protected for an amount of time. So no other company can copy it. No other company can say, okay, like now that we understand what the ingredients are in this, we can do the exact same thing and then just charge less. In fact, in the US, when you have especially like a really important drug, like one to stop cancer or one to help fight AIDS or one to help fight a bunch of other things, the company that develops that drug can literally charge almost whatever they want to for it. Now, there are definitely ethical issues about that. That's not really what this argument's about. But what this argument says is that they can charge what they want so that they can recuperate all of the upfront money that they put in to getting that disease solved, getting that medicine discovered, and getting those details figured out. Which, if you think about it, that's a pretty expensive thing to do, right? Like you have to hire a bunch of doctors to come in and stop treating patients and stop doing the other work that they're doing so that they can spend time in a laboratory trying to figure out exactly what happens. And they have to try it out on different things. They have to do research on it. It takes years sometimes. And that costs a lot of money. So these companies put a lot of money up front in order to get the drug discovered. And then the problem is that under NAFTA, that when they ship the drug to Canada, because that's what has to happen under NAFTA, that Canada says, okay, in Canada, the price for this drug, instead of being what it is in the United States, is only going to be $15 instead of being maybe $300 or $3,000. And so because they change it that much, then what happens for people in the US is that they might import it from Canada, or it might decrease the price of it, which means that the company that developed the drug can never recuperate their money. What Spiegel argues is that that stops companies from innovating. So a company thinks, well, if I'm not going to get my money back, then I don't want to put my money into it at the beginning, which means that new diseases never have solutions figured out to them, that new medicines are never discovered, that new solutions are never able to be come up with. And the reason that that is important is because the subpoint B evidence talks about how disease spread is actually also a huge impact. That if we don't have solutions to these things, that especially in the globalized world where people travel around as much as they do, that diseases could cause major issues. So that gives you kind of a secondary reason besides climate change why NAFTA would be uniquely bad, why the consequences would outweigh this. Now, just to kind of frame this in terms of how you would use these arguments against other teams, I think that most teams, like I said, on the pro are going to argue for the economy and the environment, and I think a lot of teams on the con are going to argue for the economy and the environment. So since you have these spaces, one of the things that I would suggest that you do is use the disease argument in your final speech especially to say, look, now the pro team says that NAFTA has actually helped the economy. We've read some evidence that says it hurts it. It's probably a wash. The